So far, I've described how to retrieve simple web service feeds and parse them as either XML or JSON, but before we continue on to more complex subjects, I'd like to talk about secured feeds, feeds that are protected behind what's called basic authentication. Unsecured feeds can be retrieved with simple GET requests. You don't have to provide user or password credentials, but there are other feeds that are secured, and in this case you'll need credentials of some kind. Now, I'm only talking about basic authentication and not more complex security systems such as OData. Here's an example. In this feed, I'm going to change the URL, so instead of retrieving it from a feeds directory, I'm going to retrieve it from a secure directory. So the URL is now services.hanselandpedal.com/secure/flowers.json. When I press enter or return, I'm told that this service requires a username and password. The username and password for this are feed user and feed password. And if I type them in correctly and log in, I see the feed. So when you're working with Android, you need to do a very similar thing. You need to provide the username and password as a part of your request. And I'll show you how to do that with HTTP URL connection. I'm working in a version of the project called Authenticate. And first, I'm going to show you what happens if you don't deal with this. I'll go to the code where I'm indicating where my data is coming from. And I'm going to change the address so that instead of pulling it from the feeds directory, I'm pulling it from the secure directory. That's at line 56 of the main activity class. I'm also going to move a little bit of other code around to deal with some issues I've found. I'll go to my onPostExecute method, and I'm going to take this little bit of code that makes my progress bar invisible, and I'll move it to the top of the method, because it won't matter whether my request is successful or not. I just want to make that progress bar widget invisible when my asynchronous task is complete, no matter what happens. I'm also going to wrap this little bit of code with some conditional logic. I'll add an if statement, and I'll set the condition to if result is null. And if it is, I'll display a toast message. I'll type toast and press Control Space to import it, then call makeText. For the context, I'll pass in the current instance of the main activity class with mainActivity.this. You can't just simply pass in this because you'd be talking about the instance of the async task, not the activity that contains it. Then I'll pass in a literal message of can't connect to web service and a duration of toast.lengthlong, and I'll show the message. And then I'll return from this method. If I didn't get data back, then I don't want to continue with the rest of the code. So I'll test this much. I'll run the app in the emulator, and when I click Get Data, I successfully see my toast message, can't connect to web service. So now I need to make some changes in the class that's actually making the request to the web service. So I'll open the file HTTP Manager. In order to connect to the web service, I'll need to pass in a username and a password. I want to pass that in from the main activity, so I'm going to make a copy of this version of my getData method. I'll select the entire method, and then I'll paste it into place. And then I'll go to the new version, and I'll change the signature. This will be an overload of the getData method. It'll have a different set of parameters. It'll have two more parameters called username and password, both strings. So if I call the method and pass in the username and password, I'll be using this version of the method, but if I just pass in the URI, I'll be using the original version. So here's how I'm going to transform the username and password so it can be sent to the web server. First, I need to take the username and password and concatenate them together, separated by the colon character, and then take that entire string and get a byte array from it. I'll do that work right here at the top of the method. I'll declare a byte array, and I'll name it login bytes. And I'll get its value by appending username and password. And again, I'll separate them with a colon. And I'm going to wrap that expression in a pair of parentheses, and that creates it as one string. And then from there, I'll call the method getBytes. And now I have a byte array representing my credentials. Next, I'm going to create a string builder object that I'll call login builder. I'll instantiate it with the noArguments constructor. And then I'll continue working on the string builder by immediately calling the append method on the next line. First, you need to pass in a literal string of basic, followed by a single space character. Then I'll take that byte array, and I'm going to encode it in base 64. The Android SDK includes a base 64 class that you can use. If you're familiar with the changes that have been recently made in Java 8, you might know that there's a new base 64 class that's a part of the core Java library. But the base 64 class has been a part of the Android SDK all along. So once again, I'll call the append method, and I'll pass in base 64. I'll type the name of the class and press Control Space, and be sure to import the class from android.util. From there, I'll call the method encode_to_string. The input will be my byte array, login bytes. And for the flags, I'll pass in a value of base64.default. That's a constant. And then I'll finish up the string builder. So now my login builder object contains the credentials, encoded and ready to send to the web server. Now I'll move down here to within the try block, and I'll place the cursor after the code that's creating my connection object. Before I connect with the connection object, I'll set a request property, a header value. The header value will have a name of authorization and a value that was created by the login builder object. I'll call con.addRequestProperty. I'll pass in a header name of authorization and a value of loginbuilder.toString. And that's the code I need here. As long as I pass in the correct user credentials, I should be able to connect and get the data back. So now I'll go back to my main activity class, and I'll go to the line of code where I'm making the request. Right now, I'm only passing in the first parameter that's passed into doInBackground. That's the location of my web feed. And I'll add two more parameters. And I'll use the same parameters I used in the web browser: feed user and feed password. Because I'm passing in 3 parameters, I'll be using this version of my getData method. So let's try it out. I'll run the app in the emulator, I'll click the action bar item, and I successfully retrieve the data and display the names of the flowers or products in the app's text view widget. I encourage you to keep experimenting with web authentication. See what happens if you pass in incorrect user credentials. Here's an interesting tip. If you get an exception, you'll end up in this catch block. And the way the code is structured right now, you won't have access to this connection object. You would need that connection object to find out what went wrong. So you might take this HTTP URL connection class and instead declare it up here, and then only instantiate it in the try block. Then, if you get into the exception block because of an unauthorized request, you can add this sort of code. Int status equals con.getResponseCode. In the case of an unauthorized request, the value would be 401, the standard HTTP value for an unauthorized request. Notice I'm getting more error indicators, and so I would have to wrap that with another try-catch block. But I could take that status value and find a way of sending it back up to the main activity context so I could tell the user exactly what went wrong. This is the process you use for web services with basic authentication. There are other authentication models out there, of course, such as OData, but this covers a large segment of the secured web service world.